Hello, my name is Sorensen, and this is how to play 5 Leagues from the Borderlands. 5 Leagues is a solo campaign system that is played over a series of campaign turns as you follow the journey of your Warband. Sometimes, but not always, a turn will involve your Warband going into tabletop combat. This video will cover the rules for these combat encounters. During a 5 Leagues combat encounter, you will need a measuring tool. You'll also need a few d6, I'd say a dozen should be plenty. You'll need the rulebook of course, and you will need your miniatures, which going forward will be referred to as characters or models. A 5 Leagues warband is usually composed of 6 characters, 4 heroes and 2 followers. Some heroes are also able to draw from the mystic powers of the 5 Leagues world. These heroes are called mystics, and they have access to spellcasting. Now, the models used for the demos in this video are halflings, and there are specific rules for the halfling origin in 5 Leagues. For this video, however, we will be ignoring those rules for the sake of the demonstrations. To help define our heroes further, 5 Leagues uses equipment, skills, and stats. All characters start out with the same profile across the 4 main stats. Agility is a measure of your character's ability to react, and will help determine when they act in a round. If you've played 5 Cossacks from home, this is functionally the same as the reaction stat in that game. Speed is how fast a character moves across the table. It is measured in inches and comes in 2 numbers. The second number is how far a character additionally goes when dashing. Combat skill is fighting ability, both in melee and in range. Definitely a stat to look out for. It has a plus sign attached to it because you'll often be adding it to a d6 combat roll. Toughness is resilience to harm. It will affect how easy the character is to injure and take out of the game. Mystic characters, the spellcasters of 5 Leagues, will have an additional stat called casting. It begins at +0 and, similar to combat, modifies all spellcasting rolls. Enemies in 5 Leagues will use the same stats except for agility. Instead, they get an armor rating. Skills are an important part of the 5 Leagues campaign, but they are not used within combat, so we can skip them for this video. Equipment, however, features prominently in combat, where they can have a big impact on your rolling. Enemies don't use equipment as explicitly, they generally just have modified stats and special combat abilities, but the book will specify the kind of ranged weapons enemies take. For example, the starter scenario has 1 enemy model armed with a self bow. 5 Leagues is played on a 3x3 or a 2x2 foot table. There are quite a few guidelines for terrain setup depending on the size of the board, but this is something the book encourages you to play by ear. Basically, set up what looks good for most. Put your cool set pieces in the middle so that way they'll be played, and make sure you have enough scatter terrain to break up line of sight. Once terrain is down, you will then pick one of the table edges to deploy from. The enemy deploys from the opposite edge, and any further setup instructions will be listed in the book's specific scenario rules. Now, with all your pieces laid out, it is time to play the game. 5 Leagues from the Borderlands is played across a series of battle rounds, each consisting of 5 steps each. By default, your AI opponent will always go first. This fact is modified by the initiative roll. The initiative roll determines which characters will get to go before your foes in the quick action phase. All eligible characters may take their actions in the quick action phase before the enemy activates. Once quick actions are sorted, all of your enemies will activate at once. They follow behavior guidelines depending on their equipped weapons and special rolls. After your foes have gone, all characters that did not act in the quick actions phase may now do so in the slow actions phase. And before you wrap up the round, the tracking phase is conducted to keep track of features like enemy morale or scenario rules. After that, you take it all from the top for as many rounds as the scenario requires. Did you get all that? Don't worry, because we are going to go through it once more with feelings. The initiative roll is where things kick off. You take a number of d6 equivalent to the number of your models, 4 in this demo's case. Then you give them a roll. Each dice result may then be assigned to a character. A model assigned with a result equal or below their agility may act in the upcoming quick action phase, so you're looking to roll low in most cases. A character assigned with a result greater than their agility will not act in the quick actions phase. They will, however, get to act later in the round. Characters with a higher agility will have a much better chance of going first. To better remember who gets to act when, the book suggests leaving a dice next to each model, with quick activators assigned a dice with a 1 and slow activators assigned a dice with a 6. As they finish activating, remove their dice from the table. You will, of course, be activating models in the quick action phase first. To resolve an activation, a model may move and then perform one combat action or one non-combat action. Models may move a number of inches equivalent to the first number in their speed stat. Remember, speed in 5 leagues comes in 2 numbers. If a model moves through any terrain features you have deemed difficult in the setup step, each inch counts as 2 inches instead. You cannot move through any models, friendly or otherwise, unless you have a special rule. If you want a model to fight, you may move it into base contact with an opposing model to start a melee combat. If you do this, your model is considered to have taken a combat action. If you want a model to shoot, it may only move half of its speed. To shoot a crossbow, the model must remain completely stationary. Shooting with a model is also considered a combat action. If you want a model to go further, you can opt to have them make a dash non-combat action after the move. This lets them move a number of inches equivalent to the second number of their speed stat. The dash is a non-combat action, so moving, then dashing, will end your model's activation. Dashing models are assumed to have their defenses down since they're running at full tilt, so they cannot dash into melee. Any vertical movement involves moving the vertical height in inches, as if you had moved normally. So a 3-inch climb would consume 3 inches of the model's movement range. You cannot end a climb halfway up a vertical surface, so you gotta go all the way. If a drop is 1 inch or less, a model may make it for free. Any higher than that, and they have to climb down the same way they would have climbed up. If they choose to just drop down, they might take falling damage, as detailed in the book. Models can also make horizontal jumps up to 2 inches wide, as if they were standard movement. If you choose to, you can only move 1 inch to gain access to a couple of more tactical non-combat options. You can keep down to give yourself full cover from all shooting, provided the shooter is at least 6 inches away. The model can also anticipate. This is your de facto pass option. It gives the active model an automatic place in the quick action phase for the next turn. The 2 types of combat a model can initiate after a move are missile combat and melee combat. To perform missile combat, the model must have a ranged weapon and they must have previously done the kind of move that lets them use the weapon in the first place. First, select a target for your model's ranged attack. The target must be within the weapon's range and visible to your model. That is to say, they need to be able to draw line of sight. Your models may select any target regardless of range unless there are opponents within 3 inches of them. In that case, your model will have to target the nearest visible opponent. To make a shot at your target, you roll 1d6 and add your model's combat skill, trying to meet or beat the following target numbers. If you meet the number given your target circumstance, you score a hit. Any natural roll of 1 is always considered a miss. Moreover, any ranged weapon with the special rule, limited ammunition, is now considered to be out of ammo. Unless this was their first shot in the game, in that case they just miss. Ranged weapons that are out of ammo may no longer shoot. Melee combat in 5 Leagues is a tense, deadly affair that takes place over a series of exchanges. To start melee combat, the initiating model uses their combat action after their move into base contact. All melee combat needs either participant to be in base contact with the other. The initiating model will take initiative and the role of attacker in the first exchange. Depending on the results of this first exchange, the initiative can swap between the fighting models. A melee combat can go up to 3 exchanges provided it is not stopped by either party. At the end of the 3rd exchange, the melee will always end. Models will never get stuck in a melee combat state. At the end of a combat, models will always step away 1 inch from each other. To resolve an exchange, both participating models roll a d6, adding their combat skill to the result. If the defender has a higher score, they avoid all damage and become the attacker in the following exchange. If the attacker has the higher score, they strike a blow, deal a hit, and will remain the attacker in the next exchange. Generally speaking, you will want to be on the attacking side of an exchange. If the defender loses any exchange, they must retreat 1 inch backwards if possible. The attacker may then opt to remain in place, ending the melee. Or they may step up 1 inch to remain in melee. Your enemies will always step up. Once again, the winner of any exchange gains initiative and will be considered the attacker for the next one. If at any point both models roll to a draw after modifiers, the defender will retreat 1 inch backwards with the attacker remaining in place. Then the melee ends. Whenever a model scores a hit, either in melee or ranged, you must roll to overcome the armor and then the toughness of the target. Weapons will always have 2 values for their damage statistic. The first number is for overcoming armor. The second is for overcoming toughness. Some weapons are better suited to cracking open heavily armored foes, while some are more consistent with putting a target away. You'll want a good balance of these in your party. If you run into a heavily armored model without any anti-armor weapons, you are gonna have a bad time. The first number modifies the overcome armor roll. The second number modifies the overcome toughness roll. A hit will use +0/+0 as the default unless stated otherwise. Your standard weapons will be rolling +0/+0 as will most enemies. The first thing you do when applying a hit is to check the armor of your victim. If it is 0, you will skip the overcome armor step completely. Otherwise, you roll a d6 and add the overcome armor bonus. Remember, that's the first number. If the total is equal to their armor rating, the attack still fails, but it will stun the target model. More on that in a bit. If the total is lower than the armor rating, the attack has failed. If the total is greater than the armor rating, the attack succeeds. You then proceed to step 2. To overcome toughness, you roll a d6. If it is a natural 1, you have not overcome toughness, but the target is stunned. Otherwise, you may add the overcome toughness bonus, that is the second number, and compare it to the toughness of the target. If the number is equal or lower than the target's toughness, they are stunned and wounded. If the number is higher than the toughness rating, the target becomes a casualty and is taken out of the game. The stunned state represents the models getting roughed around and disoriented badly enough to affect their performance. Stuns are temporary, and if a model is stunned in melee, it goes away as soon as an exchange finishes. Additionally, at the end of any given phase, all stunned models recover automatically. Stunned models that are forced to fight a melee exchange automatically become the defender, and they will give their opponent a combat bonus. A combat bonus simply adds +1 to the recipient's combat skill for that exchange. Simply put, the defender being stunned in combat gives the attacker +1 to their combat roll. Now, do not let the low number fool you. In 5 leagues, these +1 bonuses can be hard to come by. The wounded state does not debuff models in any way, but if a wounded model is wounded a second time, they are automatically taken out of the game, becoming a casualty. Now that is a lot to take in, so let's do a couple of examples to better illustrate how combat flows. The Halfling Sunderland in the armor attacks Grub the Goblin, stepping into combat but missing his blow. This gives priority to Grug on the second exchange, who successfully strikes back at Sunderland, pushing him back but not dealing any damage with his strike. He does it a second time, pushing him back once more, but again not being able to penetrate through the armor. The combat has gone for 3 exchanges, so the two separate. For this one, we have Perrin on defense, who is attacked by Grug. Grug successfully lands a blow, but once more does not penetrate the Halfling's armor. The Halfling is knocked back, and they go into the second exchange with Grug still on initiative. Grug does not successfully hit, Perrin successfully defends and gains initiative for the third exchange. For the third exchange, Perrin strikes a successful blow and then deals a successful wound, defeating Grug. Melee fighting is the meatiest part of 5 Leagues combat, so let's get further into the nitty-gritty. Some equipment or abilities will give your models counter-attack. Enemy models will often just have this in their entry, or they might have it because they're a higher rank. If a model with counter-attack wins an exchange as the defender, they may strike a hit. Remember that defenders usually just roll to survive during an exchange. Counter-attack lets them fight back. Parrying is granted to models in the same way. Again, some enemies will have it through special rolls or through their rank. If a character with parry rolls a natural 1 when defending in combat, instead of failing, they will deflect the blow completely, receiving no hits and no stun. The combat bonus a model gets for attacking a stunned opponent may also be acquired if a model has an ally within 1 inch of them during combat. Remember that this is a +1 to the model's combat skill for the exchange. The outnumbering combat bonus does not apply when fighting in cramped spaces, like the narrow corridor you'd expect to find in a dungeon. There are also optional combat tactics which will let you tweak your melee engagements further. They can be found on page 40 of the rulebook. If your warband has a mystic, they will be able to try and cast a spell as a non-combat action. An attempt at spellcasting will cost a strand, the magical energy resource of the worlds of 5 leagues. By default, each mystic will start each combat encounter with 3 strands. Most spells will cost 1 strand to cast. Each spell a mystic gains during character creation will have an incantation score. The higher this number, the more difficult the spell. Some spells are simple and do not need strands to cast, unless your mystic really botches the casting roll. Some spells are taxing and may only be cast once per encounter. To cast a spell, the mystic uses their non-combat action. They choose a spell to cast and they roll 2d6. If the roll is a natural 2, that's Snake Eyes, the spell fails and 1 strand is lost. If the roll is below the incantation score of the spell fails, but no strands are lost. If the result meets or exceeds the incantation score, the spellcasting succeeds, and 1 strand is expended. Unless the spell is simple, in that case it will not consume a strand. If the roll is a natural 12, that is to say, boxcars, the spell is successful and no strands are expended. The book describes the nature of spells in more detail from page 46 onwards. All enemy models in 5 leagues will have a behavior determined by the kind of weapon they are using. If so desired, and provided there's a willing player, you can also play with a game's master, who can control the enemy models instead. During enemy activation, enemy models with ranged weapons will activate first, starting with the model closest to your warband's battlefield edge. Ranged troops will try to keep in cover if they can, only advancing to keep targets in range and in sight. They will not leave cover if it would leave them exposed, and will not move into terrain that will stop them shooting, like say a water feature. Once within shooting range, enemy models will shoot at the closest target within 8 inches. If there is nothing within 8 inches, they will target the nearest opponent with a ranged weapon. If there are no targets with ranged weapons, then they will select the closest target instead. If they ever run out of ammo, they will stop shooting and will be considered melee troops. Enemies armed with melee weapons will make their way towards the nearest opponent, keeping in cover as best they can en route. This will mean that they may prioritize the less direct route if it means they get to stay in cover. However, if the only path forward will leave them out of cover, they will take the fastest route possible. If given the choice, any enemy leaders will always choose to attack one of your heroes over attacking one of your followers. The book will describe how to add leaders to your scenarios in the scenario setup rules. Some enemies, like the undead and certain monsters, will not employ these tactics at all and will simply beeline as fast as possible to the closest opponent. However, they will still not willingly move into dangerous terrain features. Keep in mind that there will still be a good amount of player judgment involved in controlling the enemy AI. The enemy is aggressive, but it is generally best not to play them like they are suicidal. Try to avoid doing things like walking enemies straight into a firing line even if they would have cover. Try to flank around with them, it will give you a more engaging combat. And finally, we will touch on the rules that will probably be the most important in the early part of your campaign. Running away. In the tracking phase, that's the very last phase, you count the number of enemy figures that were removed this current round. So keep in mind you have to track the enemy casualties on a round per round basis. Then you roll a d6 per enemy casualty and count every natural result of 1 and 2. These are morale failures. For every morale failure, remove one of the remaining enemy models as they run away. Remove the models closest to the enemy's board edge first. They're closer to the edge so they can run away faster. Enemy leaders will not run unless there are fewer than 4 enemy figures remaining. For your own side's morale, well, that is all up to you. Your own models do not take any sort of morale test. They can, however, choose to exit the game by coming within 1 inch of any battlefield edge. If you do this, remove the model from the table. Once you do, they cannot rejoin the fight for this encounter. Models that exit the fight in this manner have to roll on the Flight in the Dark table, but we will cover those rules another time as this video's already been going on for ages. Just keep in mind the starting games of 5 leagues may be punishing to your warband, and I do mean punishing, and sometimes retreat will be your best option. It will be better than having each of your heroes finish the game as a casualty. And that will be it for this video. This tutorial covers the basics of combat, which is by no means the entire 5 leagues experience. There is a robust campaign system attached to this game. If you would like to see how those systems work, I have linked some videos by other content creators that cover those rules down in the description. I would like to thank Sable Badger once again for providing the STL files used for the sandstone ruins in this video, amongst the other STL files provided. I'll get to printing them in a bit. I would also like to thank my patrons and personally shout out the patrons in the Laser Cultist tier: Brandon Fraley, Gregory Gonzalez, John Hammer, Old Paw, and Russell Brown. I do deeply appreciate the support. If you are a fan of what I'm doing on the channel and would like to see the support of more lesser-known tabletop games, then please do consider hopping on to the Patreon as well. This is All. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time.